Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for your time. We're really grateful for it. My name is Jason Donofrio. I'm the External Relations Officer for the Ocean Foundation. We're a 501c3 community foundation for the ocean based in Washington, D.C. I'm very excited to introduce our speakers today, as well as our national policy framework. But to give you a little bit of context about who we are and what our mission is. About 3 years ago, a set of stakeholders for island communities came around a discussion posing a question: in the wake of increasing storms and effects of climate change, how can we make US islands more climate resilient? That led to a series of stakeholder discussions and meetings, which culminated in the release of our Climate Strong Islands Declaration, professing our values and objectives for US island communities. That was officially launched in February of 2020 in San Juan, which then led to the official launch of the Climate Strong Islands Network in September of 2020. Now, the network is fiscally hosted by the Ocean Foundation with our partners at the Global Islands, at the Global Island Partnership, GLISPA. They are our co-host. The network is run independently by an independent steering committee, three members of which you will hear from today. Now, the network has three major objectives. Number one, drive more resources to island communities. We understand the strain that is often put on government funding, as well as foundation funding. And so over the last year and a half, we've been able to raise $740,000 in private funding to staff and help run the network. We also, number two, want to advocate for more island aware policies and reforms where they can be needed. And that is the basis for the conversation we'll have today, covering our 7 thematic policy areas. And then number three objective is to serve as a strong coalition for island communities, where we can leverage resources, share technical expertise, and work together in a collaborative manner. So I'd like to introduce now our steering committee members that you will hear from today. We have Lirio Marquez, who is the executive director for the Vieques Conservation and Historical Trust, leading the community resilience work on her island. We have Dr. Austin Shelton, who is assistant professor and director of the University of Guam Center for Island Sustainability, and also working on the NOAA Sea Grant program. And then we have Celeste Connors, executive director of Hawaii Green Growth, helping to lead efforts on the Local 2030 initiative, and also helping to spearhead the G3 dashboards that are being replicated and worked on throughout the Pacific and across island communities. So with that, I would like to turn things over to Celeste Connors, who will speak first on our policy framework. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Aloha, everybody. Thanks so much, Jason, and thanks to the team. Really delighted to be here as a member, of the Climate Strong Islands Network, and also the strong connection with the work that we are doing with many of you on this call with the Local 2030 Islands Network. And I think one way to frame it, at least in a State Department context, is that for the U.S. to put its best foot forward when engaging island economies is to put its own islands forward. And here you have a cross-section of the US islands and the deep engagement that we're able to do with islands in a really genuine peer-to-peer way, and one that also helps to achieve our broader federal objectives. So the US islands and the US as an island nation, I should say, is facing challenges similar to other island economies. The need to get on a net zero transition and support climate resilience. And we really need to fast track these solutions, as islands are certainly the canary in the coal mine. So something for you to think about as you hear these presentations with actually incredible specific solutions is how can those be used as you communicate globally to show what the U.S. is doing and how that aligns with our broader policy objectives. So I have the opportunity to share with you the national policy framework, the overall context that has 3 parts. The first includes an introduction to U.S. islands. We're all diverse. The second is a recognition of the reoccurring and cross-cutting themes. And the third section highlights 7 key issue areas and their corresponding policy recommendations. So first, the framework introduces islands as unique, geographically diverse, and culturally distinct. From the various participants joining the call today, you'll also see some U.S. islands are governed by states, while others are territories. And these different levels of government actually play a really interesting role in our ability to achieve climate resilience. This one size fits all federal policy that we've pursued is not working for islands and has not worked in the past. So, as you may know, what works in a continental context does not work in an island context all the time. So the second part of the framework, this cross-cutting themes, is really showing the underlying opportunity of islands in building climate resilience and also becoming economically resilient. And this is particularly important against the backdrop of the COVID recovery, where islands were particularly impacted. There were supply chain disruptions. In my own state of Hawaii, for example, we went from having the lowest unemployment rate to the highest unemployment rate almost overnight as a result of COVID disruption, including to our tourism economy. So we found that islands face these challenges in meeting basic needs and actually, therefore, a challenge in planning for the future. So that's the cross-cutting themes that are represented here. And finally, the focus of the national policy framework is to identify both the challenges to achieving climate resilience and then recommended policies and actions. So there are 7 key issues that emerged from our conversations and from the data. These are clean energy, watershed planning, food security, disaster preparedness, a sustainable marine economy, waste management, and transportation. So the framework articulates those issues and what can be done to address each of them and outlines policy recommendations that can support island communities to become more resilient. And our intention is to share this framework with decision makers to point to these 7 key issues and recommendations as a starter. But I have the opportunity to dive right into 2 of those, and those include clean energy and watershed management. So the first issue that is addressed in the framework is clean energy, and we're looking towards globally of meeting our clean energy transition goals. And the framework actually recognizes that U.S. islands need government policies and support to support local, independent, and reliable, affordable energy generation that's actually community driven and based on distribution systems that are locally informed and responsive to local needs. So keeping in mind the unique challenges of islands, limited land availability, and other pressing targets that we'll talk about today, there's these trade-offs, but also synergies that we look at. So we have 7 overarching policy recommendations with 14 additional specific actions that can be taken. These policy recommendations include federal government support for island communities, specifically in achieving a net zero transition, and developing effective federal funding mechanisms to both incentivize and support clean energy deployment and energy storage solutions on islands. It also calls for establishing a fund or consortium to support the collaboration of federal agencies with local island governments, indigenous communities, stateside governments, NGOs, and local community stakeholders to develop and manage island-wide land use planning efforts and helping site these clean energy projects. And further, there's watershed planning, which is another area. Now, watershed planning, I think, is actually interesting from an island context. You know, in Hawaii, we talk about the ahupua'a or Mauka to Makai ridge to reef solutions. And this is where islands can really serve as models for that ecosystem that is really relevant in the continent and elsewhere. So in speaking with members of our island community, islands really need government policies that can help them use and develop available land in ways that make them prepared for severe weather events, including sea level rise. So sustainable land use management is critical to mitigate against catastrophic disasters, and oftentimes island communities feel the need to prioritize short-term revenue generating projects over the longer term key infrastructure investments. And islands, including through this network and innovative partnerships, have developed models for short-term consensus building around long-term goals. And that's actually critically important to folks that are into interagency context. How do we have short-term consensus building term goals that are community driven? And so there are 3 overarching policy recommendations, again, with 12 additional specific actions in this area. These include meaningful community participation and having more innovative community-based or community-driven project assessment tools, as an example, so that all federal coastal and watershed-related processes, agreements, and policy decisions that impact island communities are put through a more community-driven process. Another is to provide incentives for island communities to prioritize land conservation, other development and overdevelopment, excuse me, and including protecting lands like forests and wetlands and farms, and also to provide federal funding and technical assistance for restoration efforts, like plantings and restoring entire watersheds, rather than a more patchworked approach that is focused more narrowly on different sectors. One example that I want to share that we might call a bright spot is the Alawai Watershed Collaboration. And so in Hawaii, there is a very large need for federal investment to mitigate against a large flood that would actually have economic, social, and environmental impacts in Hawaii. And this large watershed that is the sum of three smaller watersheds of Manoa, Makiki, and Palolo goes right into Waikiki, which is the economic heart of the economy. And it is a priority Army Corps of Engineers project, and yet this has failed to get the proper execution and implementation because there has not been the proper community engagement processes to date. And other factors, I think what has happened as a result is that the group has been formed, the Alawai Watershed Collaboration, which includes all levels of Hawaii government and federal partners, also community partners and private sector partners that together through initial support from a Department of Interior grant, did a comprehensive watershed management plan. They identified 8 actual projects in the watershed, from invasive species management to looking at water sensors to detect flood risk. And these projects are now being funded because the community came together. And critically, when you say progress moves at the pace of trust, this exercise really developed trust in the watershed area. Another interesting example, and I don't want to take Austin's thunder, but is in Guam, actually, this GROW initiative, the Guam Restoration of Watersheds initiative, that helps develop innovative solutions to reduce land erosion and subsequent sedimentation of downstream coral reefs. So there are really exciting examples that you'll hear today, and really encourage you to look at the framework comprehensively. I'm going to actually turn to my colleague Lirio to go over the next issue area. So thank you very much.
Buenas tardes. The next issue area, as Celeste mentioned, is food security. U.S. islands import between 70 and 90% of their food at a high cost to residents. As the reliance on food grown on the mainland U.S. has increased, locally grown food networks and distribution systems have decreased. Islands need support in transitioning their current food systems in order to diversify their food choices and sources. We recognize that all food security issues will not be solved by growing food on islands, and that some islands do not have the climate and land needed to grow food. So transportation, storage, distribution, and refrigeration issues must also be addressed to achieve sustainable, healthy, climate-resilient food systems. We have 3 overarching policy recommendations with 17 additional specific actions that can be taken to fulfill those recommendations. The 3 overarching policy recommendations are: number 1, support the establishment of locally grown agriculture programs that consider local knowledge and expertise to, for instance, ensure access to emergency farm loans after disaster, as well as programs such as minority and women farmers and ranchers and Native American loans to assist farmers and ranchers specifically in island communities. Number 2, improve food storage and distribution systems with, for example, the reevaluation of trade restrictions, custom procedures, and import taxes that adversely impact efforts in U.S. territories like Puerto Rico and Guam to access and store food. And last but not least, support long-term land use planning and practices, implementing measures such as providing incentives that prioritize the use of lands for agricultural resources over commercial development. I would like to emphasize that there is a new generation of innovative small farmers in our islands, young men and women, that are creative both in what they plant or grow and in how they do it. They are a clear example of the growing community of people farming for a climate-resistant and safer planet. And they can become important ambassadors of U.S. islands' creativity and climate resistance. I will move on to the next issue area, which is disaster preparedness. Overall, U.S. islands need government policies that support a functional and prompt response to any natural disaster that recognizes the unique challenges islands face when responding to natural disasters. The impacts of a changing climate and weather patterns have significant and sometimes devastating impacts on island communities. Many factors can complicate and slow the emergency response efforts. To not only address how to prepare island communities to weather those storms, but to also ensure effective systems are in place to help island communities in the aftermath of disasters, we established 5 main policy recommendations, some of which are: incorporate island community knowledge and expertise into federal disaster response policies. Ensure that funding mechanisms for disaster preparedness and response programs work for island communities. Require that all building, rebuilding, redesigning, or upgrading of structures and infrastructure must be done in a way that ensures that they can withstand hurricanes and meet each island's climate resiliency goals, and to ensure that islands have the funding and support to meet those requirements. But those are not the only recommendations we have considered. Others, like an amendment of FEMA policies to ensure island community members who do not own their properties or hold title to their land, can still receive disaster assistance to help them recover and rebuild after a disaster, or to make possible that funds for disaster preparedness would be available through direct grants to nonprofit organizations specifically targeted to help fund island community resiliency efforts, are also important to island communities. There is one policy recommendation that touches both food security and disaster preparedness, and that is to evaluate potential modifications to the Jones Act to ensure it doesn't create a barrier to the timely distribution of food to islands, especially during and after a natural disaster, and to ensure that it doesn't create a barrier to providing necessary, effective, and timely disaster assistance and relief to island communities in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. The Jones Act requires goods shipped between U.S. ports to be transported on ships that are built, owned, and operated by United States citizens or permanent residents. This requirement increases the cost of shipping to Hawaii, Alaska, Puerto Rico, and other U.S. islands. It also complicates relief efforts. For instance, in 2017, within a 3-week period, 3 Category 5 hurricanes hit the Gulf Coast and the Caribbean. Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. Many U.S. vessels and those ports where shipments to the Caribbean initiate were either disabled or too busy with their own relief efforts. In the case of Puerto Rico, although the Jones Act was suspended for 10 days, it was not enough time for any foreign aid or relief on foreign vessels to reach us. These modifications could ensure a link to the world for islands in their time of need. I will now transition to Austin, who is going to speak about the next key area.
Thank you very much, Lirio. As Jason mentioned, it's my role as the co-chair of the network, along with Lirio, to help bring some of these important policy issues related to islands to broader audiences around the country. So it's a pleasure to be here with you. I am also the director of the University of Guam Center for Island Sustainability and Sea Grant programs. And so one of the topic areas we've been focusing quite a bit on in Guam and throughout our other islands is creating a sustainable marine economy. And U.S. islands and the country as a whole would benefit from government policies that promote and protect our marine resources, our shoreside infrastructure, and also sustainable and thriving fisheries that support island marine economies while combating climate change at the same time. So islands, we have unique assets. We have estuaries, mangroves, the open ocean, and incredible coral reefs. In fact, where I'm from in Guam, we have the most diverse coral reefs in the United States with over 350 species. But recently, we lost nearly a third of these coral reefs in just the last decade due to rising sea surface temperatures. Now, marine resources on islands provide economic, ecological, and cultural value. They protect our shorelines. They bring in, at least in our economy in Guam, over $100 million in economic value each year. And there's lots of cultural interactions that are still able to happen with our families and communities. In a national policy framework that we have, we recommend a few things, such as focusing on infrastructure funding for building and upgrading, maintaining resilient waterfronts that can withstand hurricanes or typhoons and sea level rise, and also frequent flooding that we see. We also need infrastructure that supports more resilient coastal areas, such as shorelines and watersheds, as Celeste was speaking about earlier. Another area that would be very helpful for islands is to ensure that we all have sea grant programs that are funded by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Puerto Rico has a full sea grant program, and also in just this week, we announced in Guam that NOAA has officially designated Guam Sea Grant as a Sea Grant institution. But we're still missing Sea Grant programs in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, in American Samoa, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So this would be an excellent area for more resources to protect or to expand our marine economy opportunities. And also, as one of the largest aquaculture funders in the federal government, Sea Grant can help in this area. Where I grew up fishing in Guam, we can see how that the size and the quality of our marine fish species have reduced, and aquaculture production can take a lot of that pressure off of our coral reef fisheries and some of our pelagic species. So that was one of our topic areas. I'm going to move on to the next one, which is waste management. So there are two large sustainability challenges that all islands face that we talk about quite often. And those are things like we have an over-reliance on imports. I think Guam, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico have at least 90%, even more, of our food and goods that we consume are all imported. And then with all of those imports, we have an overproduction of waste because we have limited land and we only have so many holes that we can dig in the ground and fill with trash before we run out of space. Some of us have incineration options, but that's also comes with quite a few issues. We don't have incineration in Guam. So those holes that we dig and fill with trash are one of the current waste management issues, which is really tricky for islands. So long-term and sustainable waste management solutions are definitely needed, and we need innovative solutions like transitioning to circular economies. So these are economies where we can start thinking of waste as resources, and we can have policies that can support extended producer responsibility. And the circular economy, which really means three things: designing out waste and pollution from the start, keeping materials in use, and also regenerating our natural systems. And so to look at big solutions to recycle more, like plastics locally. We used to be able to ship plastics off to, or at least here in Guam, to China, to Indonesia, but that's all stopped during the pandemic. One of the solutions that we've been able to implement recently was the creation of the Guam Green Growth Circular Economy Makerspace and Innovation Hub, which means we now have a place for entrepreneurs and artisans to come in and work with tools like CNC routers, laser cutters, 3D printers, to take waste materials like discarded plastics, discarded lumbers. These small businesses or entrepreneurs can now turn those into new marketable products. And we're helping them with business development resources from our Guam Economic Development Authority and other areas to grow these new green industries on Guam. So these are a few areas that we'd like to help see expanded into other islands, have locally and culturally relevant programs to provide technical assistance and support in managing our waste better and in sustainable ways. Now I'll pass it back over to Lirio on the transportation topic.
Sorry, I kept the microphone off. The final issue area is transportation. That is the vital link between the island communities and the mainland and the world. The framework recognizes that US islands need government policies that support sustainable transportation options that reduce emissions and ensure safe and reliable movement of goods and people on islands and between the islands and the mainland. We know that without adequate transportation, basic services are slow or cut off. We also know that transportation policies can be complex with multiple local, state, and federal agencies involved. The 5 transportation policy recommendations reflect that complexity and the specific transportation needs of island communities. These include, number 1, create collaborative working groups with participants from the Department of Transportation, Federal Aviation Administration, Department of Commerce, and other relevant federal agencies with participation by island community representatives to address the transportation needs of island communities. Number 2, authorize and appropriate funding for consistent and reliable ferry and plane service to remote islands. Number 3, develop effective funding mechanisms to incentivize and support the transition to energy efficient and electric vehicles and ferries on island communities, including programs that help island communities remove antiquated vessels and vehicles of the island. US islands could become an example for transportation systems to other parts of the world in the transitioning to cleaner, less polluting energy and in incorporating local communities in the planning and implementation of solutions to address the needs of the residents. I will now transition back to Celeste.
Okay, sorry, I was having too much fun putting things into the chat. I think really we want to leave time for Q&A as I look around our virtual room here and all the great work that all of you are doing in the various areas of oceans, environment, science, technology, and health. Really more what I wanted to say is, a call to action and looking towards the future that I think it was former President Remegas Sao said to a United Nations meeting. He was addressing essentially as an islander, he said, help us help you. Because we're all islanders on island Earth. And islanders have been at this for a little while, looking at climate resilience, looking and feeling the near and immediate impacts of climate change. And actually how islands our US islands in particular can be a real asset for all of you. We hope when you are looking to engage very productively with other countries, other economies. We say island economies because it can be local governments and regional partners and also national partners and state partners. From my own perspective, we talk about sustainable development, but as you grow up on an island, as I have, you're taught to leave the beach better than when you found it. And that's more a regenerative approach than just a sustainable one. And I think that's what we're looking over the horizon beyond sustainability towards regeneration. And I think that's the island in mind. That's where we need to go. So the National Policy Framework is a really incredible document. It's very rich in content. It's probably a lot of the solutions that you might be looking to when you try to connect with other partners. I'll leave it at that, aside from saying we do hope that you look at that. We are always available to answer any questions. I made the connection earlier to an initiative that many of you are working on that actually State Department is leading on with interagency partners, the Local 2030 Islands Network, of which the islands represented on this call are members. Austin put in his dashboard in there. We have the Hawaii dashboard, and we're working with Puerto Rico through the Local 2030 Islands Network to develop Puerto Rico's dashboard that can track the implementation outcomes of the framework. So I'll hand it back over to Liz and Nora, I think, and look forward to answering any questions or further Q&A. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Celeste, Lirio, and Austin. Just a shout out to Austin. It is currently 3:30 in the morning in Guam right now. So he woke up extra early to be here and to present to you all. So big shout out to Austin, but also to Celeste and Lirio for beautifully articulating some of the issues that we hope to talk to you all about. So I realized that Austin, Lirio, Jason, and Celeste were able to introduce themselves, but we have quite a few folks within different areas of expertise on the call today. So I was hoping, after looking at those 7 different issue areas, maybe you could introduce yourself and, let us know your role, your title, and or which issue area you are most interested in, or maybe are focused on in your current work. We'd love to just get a sense of kind of what different issue areas you all are working in. And then we'd love to open up the floor for Q&A. We have Lirio, Austin, and Celeste here, and they also have some questions for you. So if you don't have any questions, we are also ready to ask some of you. So go ahead, put some questions in the chat, or if you have a question for one of our speakers, feel free to turn your camera on and ask said question. Thanks again for being here today. We really appreciate your time. All right, I might kick us off then. One question that we have for you all is, what are some ways that you see engaging with islands as a way to achieve some of your international goals? So, is there work that you're currently doing on islands that you think could inform our work, or that maybe we, like Celeste had kind of mentioned, how can we kind of help shape some of those examples, some of those opportunities, and some of those bright spots? So if you have an example, a connection, something that, what we discussed reminds you of some of your work, we'd love to hear from you. Yeah, Josh, please go for it.
Hi, so thank you so much for this briefing. This is really interesting. We have a project, I'm in the health office in OES. We have a project looking at climate sensitive diseases in the US API. One of the challenges, our grantee works on both the domestic and the foreign side of the house. But as a foreign affairs agency, we are quite explicitly on the foreign side of the house. And so our project is with Marshall Islands, Palau, and Micronesia, focused on dengue early warning. But I think there's kind of an interesting question there about what do you do in terms of passing those lessons along or having cross learning with folks on the domestic side. And so that's been something we've really been wrestling with. I will say it's quite a challenging dilemma because we just have this very, very strong kind of curtain that we cannot push aside in terms of working domestically. But on the other hand, certainly the obvious relevance and cross-learning opportunities are very much there. So that's been something we've been challenged with. I don't know if that's something you've encountered in your work.
Thanks so much, Josh. Really appreciate that. I'm not sure, Celeste, if anything comes to mind, but I know something we're really excited about within Climate Strong Islands Network is that we're a peer-to-peer network. And so really the value of bringing together folks in Hawaii and Guam and Puerto Rico across the world really is that we can share information. And I think Celeste and Austin also know that firsthand from working with Local 2030. So if anybody, any of our steering committee members want to comment on that, it also seems like we have another question. So I'll go to Trig next after we wrap this one up.
Yeah, Austin, that's kind of in your regional area if you wanted to respond, but I think Nora, you nailed it. Josh, I think part of it is the examples that we can use that are applicable in this space, and noting just one one observation I should say, and now I'm going to get a little bit wonky, and maybe we don't talk about the QDDR anymore, and maybe Trig raising his hand will shut me down. But it talks about bringing climate diplomacy outside of national capitals. But it also refers to a lot of incidents where we've had different diplomacy happening actually at the local level, whether it's the mayors or the governors interacting with each other. So in this case, for example, we convened a meeting recently in Palau that involved some US mayors, right? And they were talking about these types of solutions that actually spanned, in fact, they were talking about health challenges and noting actually that there might be different health issues, but in the Pacific, in this particular region, obesity has come up as one, diabetes, and these are shared challenges that we face in Hawaii as well as in Palau. But you actually had the mayor at a table with President Whips, so there are these like shared examples. How is the US approaching this? And so there's sort of two issues. Maybe it's bringing climate diplomacy outside of national capitals, engaging in many different ways we can, and to the US to actually activate local government leaders to have those more relationship driven discussions that can help better communicate what our overall foreign policy strategy is. So that's one set of issues, but maybe I'll go into a broader observation later. I can hold that in case Trig wants to ask any follow-up questions.
Celeste, I just wanted to add to that a little bit. I think what's really useful about our U.S. Climate Strong Islands Network is that we're sort of also a network of networks. So Celeste is running our Hawaii Green Growth Local 2030 Islands Network Hub. And I serve on the steering committee also with Jason. And we've got a bunch of crossovers between our islands. I'm also on the Micronesia Conservation Trust Board that deals with the Micronesia Challenge. But I just wanted to point that out, Josh Free, because I think that's one way that we're able to work very closely, U.S. island territories, particularly in the Pacific with the API islands. We don't really see too many boundaries when it comes down to it between ourselves. We act as a region. We're always welcoming Palau and Marshall Islands and FSM and vice versa, back and forth. In fact, President Panuelo from the FSM was here on Guam this week to get resources as they've finally got COVID on their shores. He's here seeking resources, and we're helping back and forth. And that's something that's been the case for dengue, because right before the COVID pandemic, Guam had our first dengue case in 40 years. And we had to go to FSM and Marshall Islands for their help and advice on how we would address that here. But I think that's a real value to these island networks and helping each other across these islands in the Pacific, and also through our Caribbean partners as well.
And if I may add, even though we are on the other side of the world, we all share a common history, a similar geography in this case, and similar problems. And our solutions can be, we would like Celeste said, we're a peer-to-peer network. So our solutions can be at least adapted, if not implanted right straight away. But we can share solutions with other islands and with mainland cities as well.
Thank you, Lirio. Thank you, Austin. Trig, do you want to ask your question?
Yes. Well, hi, everyone, and thank you for this briefing. It's very interesting. For folks who are in our bureau who we may not have briefed about the Local 2030 Island Network, it is effectively an effort that sort of builds on some of these peer-to-peer networks that have emerged in islands, including in Hawaii and Guam, and broadens the peer network to include peers from other islands working on sustainability and resilience. And that makes it a bit unique, because we're actually supporting what is effectively a locally led initiative to develop peer networks with other local influencers and experts and so forth. And the hub is Hawaii, but it includes, I know, Austin, you've been very active in this, and as well as others from across the Caribbean and the Pacific. And Lirio, I don't know how active you've been in it, but I hope, I know that Puerto Rico is a member, and we're looking forward to other members as well. And I know that the Island Strong Network itself is a member of that network. So just by way of background, and I have several questions, if that's okay. I have one question for Austin. And I think it's great that you sent around your dashboard, which I've just been looking at it, and it's very interesting to me to see how it is similar to and different from the Hawaii's Aloha Plus Challenge dashboard. And I know that yours is, that you all have gotten this up a bit more recently. I would like to know how you feel this dashboard has been useful to Guam, and whether you see it as influencing real action to advance the goals of your island community, and if there are lessons that you've taken from doing this that might be applied as we talk to international partners about it. So that's question number one. And then question number two, maybe for Celeste. One thing is that we are kind of laggards in the SDG process, and I think, by the way, I should have introduced myself to begin with. My beat is climate, and I think you have a bunch of people from around our bureau who are covering various parts of environment. Everything's international, so a lot of what you've talked about is domestic, but borders, as you all know so well, we operate across internally and externally. But my beat is climate, and I'm doing several things, the negotiations and programming, but I'm also Secretary Kerry's island person. So that's one of my hats. But I do think that we have not been as focused on sustainable development as a framework. And it has looked to me like, the structure that Guam and Hawaii and others in the network are bringing to their own local sustainability goals may have some lessons for how we look at these issues and how to advance them in a tangible way through the UN and globally. And I wonder if maybe Celeste, you could speak to that a little bit. Thank you.
Thanks, Trig. I could start with the first question about the dashboards. I think it's been extremely helpful for us here to not just track the actions that we have related to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and how we're implementing them in locally and culturally effective ways, but it's also been inspiring people to move and act that we're not necessarily doing too much in the beginning, because it's an open and transparent public dashboard that people are watching, and it's motivating some of our agency heads or nonprofit heads to catch up and get their sections done too. But we're really thankful to Celeste and the Hawaii Green Growth team for mentoring Guam to show us how to get a green growth framework started here. And so now we call Guam Green Growth our island's most comprehensive public-private partnership ever established to create our sustainable future. And we've got, it's really a partnership that our University of Guam is facilitating from our Center for Island Sustainability. But it's led quite a bit by our governor and lieutenant governor and agency heads. The governor appointed over 100 members to a large working group that includes the business sector and academia and nonprofits. And we check in quite often to make sure that we are fulfilling all of the goals that we said we would in our action framework, and that's all tracked on that Guam Green Growth Dashboard. And I think maybe Celeste will touch on the history a little bit, but Hawaii Green Growth started actually before the 17 SDGs came out. Guam started afterwards, so it was we didn't have our goals established yet, so we were able to align with all 17 goals and do it on that scale, just to make sure we weren't missing any of the good work that was already happening on island. So yeah, we see it as a very effective tool. Our governor cites our dashboard quite often when we're talking about implementation of different things. It's been in her State of the Island address for multiple years now, and it continues to move a lot of our island-wide actions forward.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Trig, and I'll riff off that, Austin. Really exciting way to track progress on the framework and the climate connection too. So actually, Trig, I think it was 2 weeks ago, at the urging of our mayors here in Hawaii, we spoke to the Climate Action Group that includes 300 U.S. mayors that have committed to climate action, and they would like to actually utilize the dashboard to start tracking their climate commitment. And so I think it's tremendous. I think this is the point I was going to make to Josh earlier, actually, and you touched on it. Climate action and also the SDGs are explicitly universal, right? And I think that's where some developed economies have actually made a mistake, and they've acknowledged that. Say Ireland, for example, which is one of the founding members of Local 2030, when they were actually presenting their report on SDGs, they only did it as a foreign affairs engagement mechanism, but not looking at also domestic policy. And that's the opportunity here with folks on this call straddling both foreign policy, but also domestic policy as examples. And that's really what I think the rest of the world is looking to the US for. With regards to the SDGs specifically and how the framework can help actually support and feed into that, is that next year will be the first leader meeting following the SDGs that were announced in 2015 by former President Obama, who emphatically said the US will meet these 17 sustainable development goals, again, of which one is climate, but it covers the landscape of OES issues, in fact. And currently, the United States is just one of 5 countries that has actually not submitted a progress report on progress towards achieving the SDGs, the other being Somalia, Afghanistan, and I'll have to come up with the other 3. But in some cases, some countries have actually submitted 2 or 3 documents. So I think there's a clear connection between what we're doing here on this call and SDG implementation, that it's universal. The other thing that Austin touched on is transparency and accountability. And that's certainly what all of us are looking towards, whether you're Jason in the philanthropy space or I imagine our federal partners. And that also both connects not just to sustainable development policy, but also I would imagine to climate change. And the fact that a lot of our partners that are looking to track progress related to things we talked about are also looking at measuring progress on our climate commitments. And that's actually, I think, a really useful mechanism. I put 2 other things into the chat because I think it's also related. It's leveraging funding, and I think that's one of the challenges that we as U.S. islands actually face, that maybe a State Department can somewhat also think about, and how we solve that is, and essentially what we're doing is we're providing great delivery for U.S. products and services, whether it's our technical agencies like NOAA or EPA, but we do struggle to get funding, actually. Our own U.S. islands that are really struggling with clear climate challenges. Literally, I can send you all a photo of a house in Hawaii last month falling into the ocean. And so as we're thinking about our global negotiations, what's the state of our state? What is happening to our U.S. islands, and what are avenues that we can get funding that is not accessible to U.S. islands, but is more accessible to international partners? That's just one question I have for folks. But then what I did put into the chat is actually the private sector as well as philanthropy is getting behind this. They have also committed to achieving climate commitments, the Paris Agreement, also to net zero transition and to the SDGs. And actually, they want to be tracked on the dashboard for the same reason that Austin mentioned. They want transparency and accountability. Final point I'll make is yesterday, the Secretary of Navy, Secretary Del Toro, was in Hawaii, and we had an opportunity to brief them. And he has just released, the Navy's just released their Climate Action 2030. And he was very interested and felt very compelled by the message that he can bring in engaging other island economies. And he spoke very fondly of a speech that he recently delivered in Fiji that I understand got very good reception. I heard from our island partners there that it was very sincere. And, naval diplomacy and soft diplomacy is critically important. So his team really want to work with all of you here. But if I might, I do want to note that who here, Trig, maybe you would know, is the actual OES lead for the Sustainable Development Goals? Because I think the folks on this call can really help be the tip of the spear and drive what the U.S. strategy will be for the SDGs when the president needs to speak to that in September 2023 at the SDG Summit in New York. Is there anyone that's responsible in the Bureau?
This is Kate. I can chime in and say that at least for a Sustainable Development Goal 14, it's going to be a couple of people in our oceans team. And I don't think either is on, but it would be Adam Bloomquist and Rebecca Wintering. And I'm happy to connect you with them, Celeste.
That would be amazing. Yeah, I think that's great. And this is where our U.S. islands can help with SDG 14 as kind of the framework. But I also think it'd be great if OES is leading on that overall SDG strategy. So we would welcome the connection. Thank you so much.
Yeah, just a bit of history. We used to lead, and I don't know if John Thompson's on, but the EDAS was always the DAS for environment and sustainable development. But back, I think in the around 2010 or 11, I think they decided to offload it. And for a while, there was no lead, but I think IO ultimately took it over for the, for the 2015 timeframe. But it's not clear how active that is now.
Thank you all so much. So we do have a few more minutes left. If there's any other questions that folks have, I encourage you to ask them now. But as we're entering these final minutes, I'd just like to remind you all that this briefing is just the beginning. And we as the Climate Strong Islands Network are here to start raising these issues, but we'd love to explore these solutions together. As Celeste and Lirio and Austin articulated, we represent different folks around the world and can be that peer-to-peer network. And we'd love to kind of highlight the opportunities that U.S. islands can bring to the international stage. And we'd love to explore those different solutions. So we invite you, we'd like to welcome further discussion, and we'd love to continue the conversation. So if there's any of these issue areas or policy recommendations that are of specific interest to you, please reach out to us. Also, along with these 3 speakers that we had today, we have a really fantastic steering committee that's made up of folks from Alaska, Maine, and we're also looking for more folks to join our network. So please spread the word, pass the message along, and stay in touch with us. So Liz just dropped into the chat. There's an email that you can get in touch with her so you can be a part of our mailing list. We'd love to keep in touch. Jason, Liz, Celeste, Austin, Lirio, any other final words before we let these kind folks go?
I just wanted to say thank you all for your time. We really greatly appreciate it. And we're happy to follow up with any information that you need, more resources that we have to share. So thank you so much. And a special thank you to our steering committee members for the presentations today.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate all of the great work. And I just did a shout out to Sherry, my A100 classmate. Thank you, everybody. And thanks to the other, to Nora and Liz, and to the other island partners that are on this call. I'm inspired daily by the work that's happening in Guam and Puerto Rico, and that we can all work together. And the national framework really provides a really robust place to find that. Hey, Sherry. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you everyone for being here with us today. And we look forward to a continuing relationship.
Thank you for the excellent presentation.
Yes, and thank you, Kate. Thanks for helping coordinate and put this together, and for spreading the word. We so appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you
we'll
very
be in
much,
touch.
everyone.
Take care, everybody. Happy Friday.